Emily Carter knew something was wrong the moment Daniel asked her to change her dress. She stood in front of the bedroom mirror, smoothing the fabric carefully over her hips. The dark green dress wasn't expensive, but it fit her well. She had spent nearly an hour deciding what to wear for the Whitmore family charity dinner. When she turned toward her husband with a small smile, Daniel hesitated. Then he said quietly, "Do you maybe have something a little more subtle?" The smile faded from her face. "This is too much," she asked softly. "No, not too much." He loosened his tie awkwardly. "I just mean my mother invited some business partners tonight. It's a pretty formal crowd." Emily looked down at herself again. The dress reached below her knees. No low neckline. No brincales. Subtle was exactly what she thought she had chosen. But after 8 years with the Whitmore family, she understood what Daniel was really asking. Blend in. Don't attract attention. Don't give his mother another reason to criticize her. "Oh," she said quietly. "Okay." Daniel immediately looked relieved. "I just don't want tonight to become stressful," he added. "You know how she gets." Emily forced a small smile and nodded. "I'll change." 20 minutes later, she walked downstairs wearing a plain navy dress she had worn dozens of times before. Daniel glanced up from his phone. "That's perfect," he said. "Perfect." Emily grabbed her coat silently. The drive to the Whitmore estate took almost 40 minutes. Rain streaked softly across the windows while the city lights blurred outside. Daniel spent most of the drive answering work emails. Emily stared quietly out the passenger window. The Whitmore family home sat in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods outside Boston. Large stone houses lined the streets behind iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges. Everything always looked polished there. Controlled. The moment they pulled into the driveway, Emily felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Luxury cars already filled the front entrance. Inside the house, warm golden light poured through massive windows while servers moved between guests carrying trays of champagne. As soon as they stepped through the front door, Victoria Whitmore appeared. Tall, elegant, perfectly composed. Even in her 60s, she carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone around her straighten slightly. Her eyes landed on Daniel first. A warm smile instantly appeared. "There you are." She kissed his cheek gently. Then her gaze shifted toward Emily. The warmth faded. Not completely, but enough. "Emily," she said politely. Victoria." Victoria's eyes briefly scanned her outfit. A small pause. Then she smiled again. "That color is much more appropriate on you." Emily felt her stomach tighten. Daniel pretended not to notice. "Mom, the traffic was awful," he said quickly. Victoria immediately turned her attention back to him. "Well, at least you made it before the donors arrived." Emily quietly removed her coat while the two of them continued talking. No one asked how her day was. No one noticed she had barely spoken. Again. The dining room slowly filled as more guests arrived. Business owners, lawyers, board members, old money families who had known the Whitmores for decades. Emily recognized many of them by now, and she knew exactly how these evenings worked. The men discussed investments. The women compared vacations, schools, and social events. Everything sounded effortless on the surface. But underneath every conversation was the same thing. Status. Who belonged? Who didn't? Emily had never fully belonged there. She grew up in a small apartment above her father's hardware store in Ohio. Her family wasn't poor, but they struggled often. Nothing in her upbringing resembled the world Daniel came from. When they first got married, Emily believed love would be enough to bridge that gap. She was wrong. Throughout dinner, Victoria continued making small comments disguised as politeness. "You still working at that bakery?" "Freelance decorating?" she asked lightly. "That sounds flexible." At one point, another woman at the table smiled warmly at Emily. "I heard your cakes are beautiful." Before Emily could answer, Victoria laughed softly. "Oh, Emily's always enjoyed little hobbies." Little hobbies. 8 years building custom wedding cakes. 8 years waking up at 4 in the morning. 8 years helping keep local businesses alive during difficult times. Reduced to a hobby in one sentence. Emily lowered her eyes toward her plate. Daniel remained silent beside her. Again. That hurt more than Victoria ever could. Because deep down, Emily didn't expect kindness from her mother-in-law anymore. But she still hoped her husband would protect her. At some point during dessert, Daniel excused himself to take a business call. The moment he left the table, Victoria dabbed her mouth carefully with a napkin. Then she looked directly at Emily. "Would you join me in the study for a moment?" Emily's pulse tightened slightly. Of course. The study was quieter than the rest of the house. Dark wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with old books and framed photographs of Whitmore family achievements stretching back generations. Victoria closed the door gently behind them. For a few seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Victoria walked toward the desk and picked up a thin folder. Something about the movement made Emily uneasy. Victoria turned slowly and placed the folder on the desk between them. Emily looked down. Legal documents. Her stomach dropped instantly. "No," she whispered. Victoria's expression remained calm. "They're divorce papers." The room suddenly felt colder. Emily stared at the folder without touching it. For a moment, she genuinely thought she might be sick. "What is this?" she asked quietly. Victoria folded her hands neatly in front of her. "It's an opportunity." Emily looked up at her in disbelief. "An opportunity?" "For Daniel," Victoria clarified. The words hit harder than Emily expected. Victoria sighed softly, almost as if this conversation exhausted her. "You're a kind woman, Emily. I truly believe that." The sentence sounded practiced, carefully rehearsed. But kindness alone is not enough for the kind of life Daniel is building. Emily felt heat rising behind her eyes. "I'm his wife." "Yes," Victoria said calmly. "But you are also a limitation." The silence afterward felt suffocating. Emily stared at her, unable to process the cruelty hidden beneath such polished words. Victoria continued speaking gently, almost kindly. "Daniel has extraordinary potential. His career is accelerating quickly. Important people are beginning to notice him." She paused briefly. "And whether you realize it or not, people also notice who stands beside him." Emily felt something crack quietly inside her chest. "So that's what this is about," she whispered. Victoria's face softened slightly. "This is about protecting my son's future." "No," Emily said, her voice shaking now. "This is about you being embarrassed by me." For the first time, Victoria's expression hardened. "You come from completely different worlds, Emily. And yet your son married me." Victoria held her gaze steadily. "Yes," she replied quietly. "And I believe he made that decision before fully understanding what his future would require." Emily looked down at the divorce papers again. Her hands trembled slightly. Then she asked the question she was almost afraid to hear answered. "Does Daniel know about this?" Victoria hesitated. Just long enough. And that hesitation told Emily everything. Tears burned her eyes instantly. Because maybe Daniel hadn't prepared the papers himself. Maybe he hadn't asked for this conversation. But he knew. And he allowed it to happen. Victoria's voice softened again. "If you truly love him," she said quietly, "you'll stop forcing him to choose between his marriage and the life he deserves." Emily let out a shaky breath. For 8 years, she had tolerated criticism, dismissal, cold smiles, subtle humiliation. Because she loved Daniel. Because she believed eventually they would become a real family. But standing there in that quiet office, staring at divorce papers placed in front of her like a business transaction, Emily finally understood something painful. She had spent years trying to earn a place in a family that had already decided she didn't belong. And the worst part wasn't Victoria's cruelty. It was Daniel's silence. Emily signed the divorce papers 3 weeks later. Not because she stopped loving Daniel, but because somewhere deep down, she finally understood something painful. A marriage could not survive when one person was constantly asked to become smaller to keep everyone else comfortable. The actual divorce process was quiet. No screaming. No dramatic courtroom scenes. No public betrayal. Just paperwork. Short meetings with lawyers. Cold signatures across polished tables. Daniel barely looked at her during the final hearing. That hurt more than if he had been angry, because anger would have meant he was still fighting for something. Instead, he looked exhausted, defeated, like someone allowing life to happen to him instead of making choices himself. When everything was finalized, he walked beside her toward the courthouse elevator in complete silence. Emily kept her eyes forward. The sound of her heels against the marble floor echoed softly through the hallway. Finally, just before the elevator doors opened, Daniel spoke. "I never wanted things to end like this." Emily almost laughed at the sentence. Not because it was funny, because it sounded so unbelievably small compared to everything that had happened. She turned toward him slowly. "But you still let it happen." Daniel opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. No defense. No explanation. And somehow, that silence answered every question she still had. The elevator doors opened. Emily stepped inside alone. And just like that, 8 years of marriage ended without either of them truly saying goodbye. The apartment she moved into afterward sat above a tiny used bookstore in Somerville. The ceilings were low. The plumbing rattled sometimes. And the radiator made strange noises at night. But for the first time in years, no one criticized how she decorated the space. No one corrected how loudly she laughed, or what she wore, or whether her career sounded impressive enough at dinner parties. Still, freedom didn't feel empowering at first. It felt empty. The first few weeks were brutal. Emily cried in grocery store parking lots, in the shower, sometimes while folding laundry for no reason at all. Everything reminded her of the life she lost. A coffee mug Daniel used every morning. A playlist from road trips they used to take. The instinct to text him whenever something funny happened during the day. Grief showed up in strange moments. One night, she stood frozen in the pasta aisle for almost 10 minutes because she realized she no longer had to buy the expensive imported brand Victoria preferred during family dinners. And somehow that tiny realization broke her completely. Because for years, even the smallest parts of her life had quietly revolved around other people's expectations. Now there was only silence. And herself. Some mornings, she stayed in bed too long staring at the ceiling while sunlight slowly moved across the walls. The future felt blurry, uncertain, embarrassing. Divorce at 34 wasn't the life she imagined for herself. Especially not after sacrificing so much trying to make her marriage work. At first, she avoided social media entirely. She didn't want to see engagement photos, family vacations, perfect lives. But eventually, bills forced reality back into focus. Emily still had skills, even if Victoria spent years dismissing them as cute little hobbies. Before marriage consumed most of her energy, Emily had built a strong reputation as a pastry decorator. Wedding cakes, birthday cakes, dessert tables for small events. She was genuinely talented. People trusted her work because she cared deeply about details. And unlike many upscale bakeries, Emily remembered customers' stories, their children's names, anniversaries, favorite flavors. She made people feel seen. That mattered. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes in her apartment kitchen, Emily found an old notebook filled with cake sketches she had drawn years earlier. Some pages still had tiny stains of frosting near the corners. She sat on the floor flipping through them slowly. 3-tier wedding cakes. Sis en el pie ideas. Dreams she quietly abandoned over time. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. 5 years earlier, a local investor had offered Emily the opportunity to co-own a small bakery downtown. She almost accepted. But Daniel had just received a major promotion then. The hours would have conflicted with his networking events, corporate dinners, weekend obligations. Victoria called the bakery idea unstable. Daniel told Emily maybe they could revisit it later. Later never came. Sitting on the floor of her tiny apartment, Emily suddenly realized how many versions of herself she had postponed waiting for the right time. And for the first time since the divorce, something inside her shifted slightly. Not confidence, not happiness, just awareness that maybe her life wasn't completely over. The next morning, she posted photos of a few homemade pastries online. Nothing dramatic. Just simple cinnamon rolls and strawberry cupcakes arranged near her apartment window, where the morning light looked softest. She expected maybe a few friends to respond. Instead, old customers started messaging her almost immediately. Are you taking orders again? I've missed your cake so much. My daughter still talks about your birthday cookies. Emily stared at her phone in genuine surprise. By the end of the day, she had 7 small orders. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was something. The first few weeks were exhausting. She baked from her tiny apartment kitchen late into the night, balancing trays on limited counter space while music played softly in the background. Sometimes flour covered half the floor. Sometimes frosting failed completely. But slowly, the apartment stopped feeling sad. It started feeling alive. One afternoon, an elderly woman picked up a lemon cake Emily made for her granddaughter's birthday. Before leaving, the woman paused near the doorway. You know, she said gently, this place smells happy. Emily smiled politely after the customer left. But once the door closed, she unexpectedly burst into tears. Because she realized something painful. No one had used words like warm, comforting, or joyful to describe her life in years. Especially not inside the Whitmore family. Weeks turned into months. More customers arrived. A local cafe offered to sell her pastries on weekends. Then someone posted a video online showing Emily decorating a wedding cake, while quietly explaining how she learned baking from her grandmother as a child. The video spread far faster than she expected. People loved her voice, her calmness, her honesty. Comments flooded in. She seems so genuine. This feels comforting somehow. You can tell she bakes with love. Emily read those messages late one night sitting alone at her kitchen counter. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. Meanwhile, Daniel's life was moving in the opposite direction. At least from what little Emily occasionally heard through mutual friends. He worked constantly now, rarely attended social gatherings, looked exhausted most of the time. But Emily tried not to think about him too often, because every time she did, the same painful question returned. Would things have been different if he had chosen her sooner? One rainy evening after finishing a 3-tier anniversary cake, Emily stood near the apartment window holding a cup of tea. Below her, people hurried through wet streets carrying umbrellas beneath glowing streetlights. The bookstore downstairs was closing for the night. Soft jazz drifted faintly through the floorboards. And suddenly, in the middle of that quiet little apartment, Emily noticed something strange. For the first time in a very long time, she felt peaceful. Not because her life was perfect. It wasn't. She was still rebuilding, still healing, still lonely sometimes. But the constant pressure to prove she was good enough had finally disappeared. And without realizing it, Emily had started becoming herself again. Victoria Whitmore spent most of her life believing she understood people, especially her son. Daniel had always been disciplined, ambitious, and composed, the kind of child who never caused problems. Even as a teenager, he organized his schedule better than most adults. He graduated near the top of his class, built connections effortlessly, and entered the corporate world with the same calm determination that impressed everyone around him. Victoria used to tell her friends proudly, Daniel was born knowing exactly who he wanted to become. For years, she believed Emily distracted him from that future. Too emotional, too ordinary, too soft for the world Daniel was entering. And after the divorce, Victoria convinced herself she had done the right thing. At first, everything seemed fine. Daniel received another promotion 3 months after the divorce. His salary increased. His professional network expanded. He attended more executive dinners and investor meetings than ever before. From the outside, his life looked successful. Exactly the way Victoria always imagined. But slowly, small things started changing. At first, she barely noticed. Daniel stopped answering calls as often. Family dinners became shorter. He looked distracted during conversations. One Sunday afternoon, Victoria hosted lunch at the estate like she always did. Daniel arrived nearly 40 minutes late. When he walked into the dining room, Victoria immediately paused. He looked exhausted. Not dramatically. Not in some obvious, catastrophic way. Just worn down. His tie hung loose around his neck. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. And for the first time in years, his usually polished appearance looked careless. Long week? Victoria asked lightly. Daniel gave a tired nod. Something like that. During lunch, he barely touched his food. That alone unsettled Victoria more than she expected. Emily used to joke that Daniel could eat the same lemon herb chicken 3 nights in a row and still call it his favorite meal. But now he mostly pushed food around his plate while checking work emails between conversations. At one point Victoria asked, "How's the new project going?" Daniel stared at his wine glass for a second before answering, "Fine. Just fine. No excitement. No energy. Nothing like the sun she used to know." After lunch, Daniel left earlier than usual. Victoria stood near the front window watching his car disappear down the driveway. Something uncomfortable settled in her chest. For the first time, success no longer seemed to be making him happier. Weeks passed, then months, and the distance between them quietly grew. Daniel still attended work functions, still performed well professionally, still smiled in photographs. But Victoria began noticing something strange. Every smile looked forced now, like he was completing obligations instead of living his life. One evening she attended a corporate charity gala, where Daniel was being recognized for leadership achievements. People surrounded him constantly. Executives shook his hand. Investors praised his work. Women complimented his charm. Daniel smiled politely through all of it. But Victoria noticed something no one else seemed to see. The moment conversations ended, his expression immediately went empty again. At one point during the event, Victoria watched him standing alone near the bar staring down at his phone. Not typing, not reading, just staring, like he was waiting for a message that never came. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, Emily suddenly crossed her mind. The realization irritated her instantly. Still, the thought lingered. Later that week, Victoria called Daniel unexpectedly. "You should come by Sunday," she said. "It's been a while since we've had dinner together." There was a pause on the line. Then Daniel sighed quietly. "I'll try." Try. The word bothered her more than it should have. Sunday came. Daniel canceled an hour beforehand. Work emergency. The following week he canceled again. Then again. Eventually Victoria stopped asking. But the uneasiness inside her continued growing. One rainy Thursday evening, Victoria attended a fundraiser downtown with several longtime friends. While waiting near the valet stand afterward, one of the women suddenly smiled. "Oh, I saw Emily recently," she said casually. Victoria stiffened slightly. "You did?" "Yes. At that little bakery cafe near Somerville." The woman laughed softly. "She looks wonderful, honestly." Victoria didn't respond immediately. The woman continued. "She made the desserts for my niece's engagement party." Then she added something unexpected. "I haven't seen her smile like that in years." The comment lingered with Victoria all the way home. Smile like that in years. That night, unable to sleep, Victoria found herself searching Emily's name online for the first time since the divorce. Several videos appeared almost immediately. Short baking clips, cake decorating tutorials, customers tagging her bakery orders. Victoria clicked one reluctantly. Emily stood in a tiny kitchen dusted lightly with flour, laughing softly while explaining how to fix overmixed batter. The lighting was simple, the background imperfect. But Emily looked happy, genuinely happy. Victoria frowned slightly. Not because she disliked seeing it, because something about it felt deeply unsettling. For years, Victoria convinced herself Emily depended on the Whitmore family for stability. But watching her now, Emily looked lighter without them. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed to be collapsing quietly inside the very life Victoria fought to protect. The thought disturbed her far more than she wanted to admit. 3 nights later, Victoria made a decision she normally never would have made. Without calling ahead, she drove to Daniel's condo after work. The building lobby greeted her with soft jazz music and polished marble floors. The concierge recognized her immediately. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitmore." Victoria smiled politely before stepping into the elevator. As the doors opened onto Daniel's floor, a strange nervousness settled in her stomach. She knocked once. No answer. Then she noticed the light beneath the door. After another knock, footsteps approached slowly. Daniel opened the door wearing sweatpants and an old college t-shirt Victoria hadn't seen in years. He looked startled. Mom! Victoria froze slightly. The condo behind him was a mess. Not filthy, but neglected. Takeout containers sat on the kitchen counter. Laundry rested unfolded on the couch. Several empty coffee cups crowded his desk. The air itself felt tired. Victoria stepped inside slowly. Daniel. He rubbed his face wearily. I've just been busy. But Victoria barely heard him. Because suddenly she noticed what was missing. Warmth. For years, Emily filled every home they lived in with small quiet comforts Daniel never seemed to notice. Fresh flowers near the kitchen sink. Music playing softly while dinner cooked. Candles during winter evenings. Clean blankets folded carefully across the couch. Not expensive things. Just care. Now the condo felt cold despite its luxury. Like a place someone slept in. Not lived in. Victoria turned toward her son again. And for the first time in months, she truly looked at him. Not the executive. Not the successful Whitmore heir. Just Daniel. And what she saw frightened her. He looked lonely. Not because he was physically alone. Because he no longer seemed emotionally connected to anything around him. Victoria's chest tightened unexpectedly. Have you eaten? She asked quietly. Daniel gave a tired shrug. I ordered something earlier. Earlier. There was no food out. Meaning he probably hadn't eaten at all. Victoria walked slowly toward the kitchen. Then stopped. Near the coffee machine sat a folded piece of paper tucked beside an old ceramic bowl Emily used to keep fruit in. Victoria recognized Emily's handwriting instantly. She picked it up carefully. Only one sentence was written there. I hope this place still feels like home, even when I'm no longer in it. Victoria stared at the note silently. And suddenly something inside her cracked. Because for the first time, she realized Emily had spent years quietly holding Daniel's life together in ways none of them ever appreciated until she was gone. Rain fell steadily across Boston that afternoon. Not the dramatic kind that came with thunder or strong winds. Just a cold, persistent rain that turned sidewalks silver and blurred the city behind fogged windows. Victoria Whitmore sat alone in her car outside a small bakery cafe in Somerville, her hands resting motionless on the steering wheel. The sign above the window read, Elm and Honey Bakery. Simple. Warm. Nothing like the elegant restaurants or upscale lounges the Whitmore family usually frequented. For the past 20 minutes, Victoria had done nothing except sit there watching through the glass. Watching Emily. Inside the bakery, soft golden lights reflected against wooden shelves lined with fresh bread and pastries. Small handwritten chalkboard menus leaned beside glass display cases filled with croissants, cinnamon rolls, and cakes decorated with delicate flowers. The place wasn't luxurious, but it felt alive. Customers filled nearly every table despite the weather outside. A young couple sat near the window sharing coffee. An elderly man read a newspaper beside the counter. Two college students laughed quietly over laptops near the back wall. And in the center of it all, Emily moved through the bakery carrying a tray of fresh pastries. Victoria barely recognized her at first. Not because Emily looked dramatically different. Because she looked lighter. Her hair was pulled back loosely. A little flour dusted the sleeve of her sweater. And every few minutes, someone stopped her to talk. A customer thanked her for remembering their usual order. A little girl waved excitedly from a table near the window. One of the employees bumped shoulders with her playfully, while carrying boxes toward the kitchen. Then Emily laughed. A real laugh. Not the careful, polite laugh Victoria had heard for years at family dinners. This one was soft. Natural. Unforced. Victoria felt something tighten painfully inside her chest. Because suddenly she realized something she had never truly allowed herself to see before. Emily had spent years trying to survive inside the Whitmore family. And somehow, Victoria had mistaken survival for weakness. Inside the bakery, Emily wiped down the counter while speaking warmly to an older customer. Her entire posture looked different now. Relaxed. Present. Not constantly bracing herself for criticism. Victoria swallowed slowly. The windshield wipers moved back and forth rhythmically as rain continued falling across the glass. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, guilt began pressing heavier against her chest with every minute she sat there. Not small guilt. Not embarrassment. Something deeper. The kind that arrives when a person finally understands the damage they caused long after it's too late to undo it. A memory surfaced suddenly. 3 years earlier, Emily had hosted Christmas dinner for the family in Daniel's old townhouse. Victoria remembered arriving and immediately criticizing the table settings because the silverware didn't match properly. Emily apologized instantly, then spent the rest of the evening quietly fixing tiny details no one else even noticed. At the time, Victoria believed she was teaching Emily how to fit into their world. Now sitting outside this tiny bakery, the memory made her feel ashamed, because Emily had never needed to become more polished. The Whitmores simply failed to appreciate kindness when they were receiving it every day. Inside the bakery, one of the employees suddenly said something that made everyone behind the counter laugh. Emily leaned against the counter smiling, her cheeks slightly flushed from the warmth of the ovens. And Victoria noticed something else. People here genuinely loved her. Not because of her last name. Not because of status. Not because they wanted something from her. They simply enjoyed being around her. The realization hurt more than Victoria expected. For years, she convinced herself Emily would never survive without Daniel. But now it was Daniel falling apart quietly while Emily rebuilt herself from nothing. Victoria looked down briefly at her trembling hands, then finally made herself open the car door. Cold rain immediately soaked the edge of her coat as she hurried toward the bakery entrance. The small bell above the door chimed softly when she stepped inside. Warm air wrapped around her instantly, cinnamon, coffee, vanilla, fresh bread. The bakery quieted slightly, not because people recognized her, because Emily did. From behind the counter, Emily froze completely. For a brief second, neither woman moved. Victoria suddenly became painfully aware of how long it had been since they'd seen each other. 6 months. Emily looked startled, but not angry. That somehow made everything harder. One of the younger employees glanced between them. "Emily," she asked softly. "You okay?" Emily nodded quickly. "Yes. I'm fine." Victoria noticed the employee immediately step back protectively anyway. Another strange ache moved through her chest. These people cared about Emily enough to notice discomfort instantly. Meanwhile, the Whitmore family had ignored her pain for years. Victoria swallowed carefully. "Could we talk for a moment?" she asked quietly. Emily hesitated, then nodded toward a small corner table near the window. "Sure." The rain tapped softly against the glass while they sat across from one another in silence. Up close, Victoria noticed tiny changes in Emily she hadn't expected. There was still softness in her expression, still kindness. But there was also something new now. Steadiness. The nervousness Emily used to carry around the Whitmore family was gone. Emily folded her hands carefully around a mug of tea. "What brings you here?" she asked gently. Victoria opened her mouth, then stopped, because suddenly she realized she had spent her entire life speaking confidently, controlling conversations, directing outcomes, maintaining composure. But now, sitting across from the woman she had deeply hurt, words felt strangely difficult. Finally, Victoria looked down. "I owe you an apology." Emily stayed quiet. Victoria continued slowly. "I thought I was protecting Daniel." Her voice shook slightly. "I convinced myself you weren't right for his future." The silence between them remained calm, not hostile. That somehow made Victoria's guilt worse. She looked around the bakery briefly, at the warmth, the life, the people smiling near the counter, then back at Emily. "I was wrong." Emily's eyes softened slightly, but she still said nothing. Victoria let out an uneven breath. "I spent years criticizing you because you didn't fit into our world." Her voice cracked unexpectedly. "But now I realize," she paused, struggling to continue. "Our world was the thing hurting both of you." Emily lowered her eyes toward the table. Rain continued falling outside. A customer quietly exited near the front door, while soft jazz played overhead. Everything felt painfully normal. And somehow that made the conversation even more emotional. Victoria's hands trembled lightly now. "Daniel isn't okay," she admitted quietly. Emily's expression shifted immediately. Not dramatic panic, just concern. Instinctive concern. Even after everything. Victoria noticed it instantly. And it broke something inside her completely. Because after all the cruelty, all the judgment, all the humiliation, Emily still cared whether Daniel was hurting. Victoria pressed trembling fingers against her lips briefly before whispering, "You loved him better than any of us did." Tears finally filled her eyes. Real tears. The kind she usually never allowed herself to show. Emily looked stunned. Victoria shook her head slowly. "I see that now." For several seconds, her breathing became uneven. Then suddenly, overwhelmed by the full weight of her regret, Victoria stood too quickly from the table. Her chair scraped softly across the floor. Several customers glanced over. But Victoria no longer cared. Because for the first time in her life, pride felt unbearable. And before Emily could react, Victoria Whitmore dropped to her knees beside the table. The entire bakery went silent. Emily immediately stood up in shock. "Victoria." But the older woman was already crying. Not loudly, not theatrically, just quietly shattered. "I'm sorry," she whispered through tears. The words trembled apart as they left her mouth. "I was so cruel to you." Emily stared at her in complete disbelief. People around the bakery watched silently, unsure whether to look away. Victoria's shoulders shook slightly as years of guilt finally surfaced. Then, with tears running down her face, she looked up at Emily and whispered the one thing she never imagined herself saying. "Please come back to our family." The bakery remained completely silent. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows while Victoria Whitmore knelt beside the table, trembling under the weight of her own regret. Emily stood frozen. For a moment, she genuinely didn't know what to do. 6 months earlier, this woman had calmly placed divorce papers in front of her like a business agreement. Now she was crying in the middle of a small bakery asking her to come back. Nothing about the moment felt dramatic. It felt painfully human. Emily glanced around briefly. A few customers quietly looked away, pretending not to stare. One employee near the counter looked deeply uncomfortable, unsure whether to step in. Emily swallowed hard. Then softly said, "Victoria, please stand up." Victoria shook her head immediately. "No." Her voice cracked again. "I spent years making you feel like you weren't enough." Tears slid down her face quietly now. "And you never deserved any of it." Emily's chest tightened painfully. Because this was the first time anyone in the Whitmore family had truly acknowledged what happened to her. Not minimized it. Not explained it away. Actually acknowledged it. Slowly, Emily crouched beside her. The movement surprised Victoria enough that she finally looked up. People who had spent years hurting Emily usually expected one of two reactions: anger or immediate forgiveness. But Emily felt neither. Only sadness. Sadness for the years they all lost trying to force themselves into roles that were destroying them quietly. "You don't have to kneel," Emily said gently. Victoria let out an uneven breath. "Yes," she whispered. "Ido." Emily looked at her for a long moment, then carefully helped her stand. The older woman looked suddenly smaller than she ever had before. Not physically, emotionally. Like guilt had stripped away the authority she carried for so many years. Emily guided her back into the chair beside the window. Neither woman spoke for a while afterward. The bakery slowly returned to life around them. Coffee machines hissed softly. Someone quietly opened the front door before hurrying back into the rain. Normal sounds. Normal moments. Yet everything between them had changed. Finally, Victoria wiped her eyes carefully and looked down at her trembling hands. "I thought success would make Daniel happy," she admitted quietly. Emily stayed silent. Victoria gave a weak, exhausted laugh. "I spent his entire life teaching him how to achieve things." Her eyes drifted toward the rain outside. "But I never taught him how to protect the people he loved." The words landed heavily between them. Because they were true. Emily thought about all the moments Daniel stayed silent over the years. Every uncomfortable dinner. Every small humiliation. Every time he asked her to ignore another cruel comment to keep the peace. At the time, she believed silence meant weakness. Now she realized something else. Daniel had been raised in a family where emotional comfort was often sacrificed for appearances. Where achievement mattered more than vulnerability. Where conflict was avoided instead of healed. And somewhere along the way, He learned that disappointing his mother felt more dangerous than losing himself. Or losing her. Victoria looked back at Emily carefully. He misses you, she whispered. Emily's eyes lowered toward the table. For months, she tried not to think too deeply about Daniel. Not because she stopped loving him. Because loving him still hurt. He should have fought for you, Victoria continued softly. Emily closed her eyes briefly. Hearing those words from Victoria felt strangely overwhelming. Because for years, she had secretly hoped someone in that family would finally say it aloud. That she wasn't asking for too much. That wanting protection from your husband wasn't unreasonable. That love shouldn't require constant self-erasure. When Emily finally looked up again, her expression remained calm. But steady. Why now? She asked quietly. Victoria hesitated. Then answered honestly. Because I finally saw what my son became after losing you. Her voice trembled again. And because I realized, she paused carefully. You were never the thing holding him back. The rain outside had softened now into a light drizzle. Inside the bakery, warm evening light reflected across the windows while employees quietly prepared for closing. Emily leaned back slightly in her chair. 6 months ago, hearing those words might have broken her completely. Now, they simply made her tired. Not bitter. Just emotionally exhausted from carrying pain for so long. Victoria looked at her carefully. Would you ever consider speaking to him? Emily didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was complicated. Part of her missed Daniel deeply. The familiar parts. The quiet parts. The version of him that used to dance with her in the kitchen late at night when they were still young and hopeful. But another part of her remembered the loneliness of loving someone who never fully stood beside her. And she could not ignore that anymore. Finally, Emily spoke softly. I loved your son very much. Victoria's eyes filled again. I know. Emily looked down at the tea growing cold between her hands. But love alone wasn't enough to save us. The older woman nodded slowly. For the first time in her life, Victoria didn't argue. Didn't defend. Didn't control the conversation. She simply listened. And somehow that mattered. After a long silence, Emily stood. I should finish closing. Victoria rose carefully as well. For a moment, neither woman seemed sure what came next. Then Victoria quietly said, You built something beautiful here. Emily glanced around the bakery. At the chalkboard menus. The warm lights. The lingering smell of cinnamon and coffee. A small smile touched her lips. Yeah, she said softly. I think I did. Victoria looked at her with an expression filled entirely with regret. I spent years believing strength looked like perfection, she whispered. Her voice shook again. But you. She paused, searching for the words. You created warmth everywhere you went. Emily felt emotion tighten unexpectedly in her chest. Because for years, that was all she ever wanted someone in the Whitmore family to notice. Not whether she sounded sophisticated enough. Or impressive enough. Just that she cared. Victoria slowly reached for her coat. Then stopped near the door. Without turning around, she asked quietly. If Daniel came here, would you listen to him? Emily stared silently at the rain outside. The answer wasn't simple. Healing never was. Finally she said softly, I don't know. And for the first time, that answer felt honest. Not cruel. Not hopeful. Just true. Victoria nodded slowly. Then she left. The small bell above the bakery door chimed gently as she disappeared into the wet evening outside. Emily remained standing there long after the door closed. The bakery had emptied completely now. Only soft music played overhead while the city outside blurred beneath rain-covered windows. She looked around the quiet room she built herself. 6 months earlier, she thought losing her marriage meant losing her future. Instead, somewhere between heartbreak and rebuilding, she found herself again. Not the version shaped by expectations. Not the woman constantly trying to earn approval. Just herself. And for the first time in years, that finally felt like enough.